Imagine you are alone in a room. Not a comfortable room, a sealed one, underground. Banks of screens surround you, their light the only color in the dark. Outside those walls, nothing you can touch. Outside those walls, the entire world. Now imagine an alarm sounds. Not a test alarm, not a drill, a real one. The kind of alarm that, in your country, in your doctrine, in the system you have been trained to serve, means one thing and one thing only. Nuclear launch detected. The protocol is clear. It was written long before you sat down in that chair. Verify. Report. Escalate. The machine behind you has already begun its calculation. Somewhere above you, generals wait. Somewhere above them, a leader waits. And somewhere behind the horizon, the missiles your system has detected are, according to every sensor in front of you, already in the air. You have minutes, not hours, not days, minutes, to decide whether the world ends tonight. And then, you hesitate. Not from cowardice, not from confusion, but from something quieter than either of those things. Something that protocol cannot account for. Something that no manual, no doctrine, no chain of command had ever trained you to use in a moment like this. Doubt. This is the story of one night, one man, one decision that the rest of the world never knew was made. Welcome to Echoes of Greatness. Please like, share, and subscribe. By the autumn of 1983, the Cold War had reached a temperature that the word cold no longer captured. 40 years had passed since the first atomic bomb was built in the desert of New Mexico. In the decades that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union had accumulated enough nuclear warheads to destroy every major city on Earth. Not once, but many times over. The doctrine that held the peace was, by its own design, a kind of madness. If either side launched, the other would launch back. Mutual destruction, total, guaranteed. It was called deterrence, and it worked, not because either side trusted the other, but because both sides feared the outcome. But in 1983, that fragile balance was under extraordinary strain. In March of that year, American President Ronald Reagan had announced plans for a space-based missile defense system, one that Soviet military strategists believed could eventually allow the United States to launch a first strike and then shield itself from retaliation. If that were true, deterrence would collapse, and the side left vulnerable would have every incentive to strike first before the shield was complete. Soviet military thinking had for years been shaped by a fear not of nuclear war itself, but of being caught unprepared for one. The doctrine demanded speed. It demanded that any indication of incoming missiles be reported immediately, escalated immediately, and, if confirmed, answered immediately. The entire architecture of Soviet nuclear response was built on the assumption that hesitation was the most dangerous thing of all. Into this world, in September of 1983, stepped a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. He was not a general. He was not a politician. He was not a man whose name appeared in newspapers or whose decisions shaped summits. He was a duty officer, a trained specialist assigned to monitor the Soviet early warning system from a command bunker outside Moscow called Serpukhov 15. Petrov was, by most accounts, intelligent and methodical. He understood the system he monitored, its capabilities and its limits, better than most. He had been involved in its development. He knew what it could do. He also knew, in the way that engineers sometimes know, what it could get wrong. That knowledge would matter more than he could have imagined. It was just past midnight on September 26, 1983. Petrov had taken over the duty shift not long before. The bunker hummed with the quiet routine of a night that, so far, was like any other. Operators moved between stations. Screens displayed their usual feeds. The early warning satellites, positioned to monitor American missile fields, sent back their data in steady, unremarkable streams. Then the alarm sounded. Not a gentle alert. A full system alarm, the kind that made every person in the room stop and turn. The screens showed it clearly. One missile, launched from the United States, tracked, confirmed by the satellite system. Petrov looked at the readout. One missile. Just one. He thought about that. If the United States had decided to begin a nuclear war, if they had made that irreversible choice, they would not send one missile. No strategist, no doctrine, no rational actor would open a nuclear exchange with a single warhead. The logic of first strike theory demanded a massive, overwhelming launch. Hundreds of missiles, not one. But the system was showing him one. And then, before he could process the first alarm, the screen changed again. A second missile, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The system now read 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Launched, inbound, confidence level, highest. The room around Petrov was no longer calm. Alarms were sounding. Subordinates were shouting status updates. Every protocol in the Soviet military structure now demanded one thing. Petrov must pick up the telephone that connected him to his superior officers and report an incoming nuclear attack. He did not pick up the telephone. Not yet. What Petrov was doing in those seconds, and they were seconds, each one carrying the weight of millions of lives, was something no protocol could fully describe. He was thinking. The system said attack. The system had a confidence rating that should have ended all doubt. But Petrov had spent years understanding exactly how this system worked. And he knew something that the alarm did not show. The system had never been fully tested against real-world conditions. It had been developed quickly, under pressure, in an arms race that valued speed over certainty. Petrov knew that the satellite sensors it relied on could, under specific atmospheric conditions, mistake the reflection of sunlight off clouds for the infrared signature of a missile launch. He knew this was possible. He could not prove it was happening. The ground-based radar systems, a separate network that would provide secondary confirmation, had detected nothing. No launches, no inbound missiles. But ground radar could not see over the horizon far enough to confirm or deny at this stage. Their silence proved nothing. 50 people in that bunker were watching Petrov. His hand was near the telephone. If he reported the launch as confirmed, if he made that call, the information would move up the chain with extraordinary speed. It would reach men who had, within minutes, the authority to order a retaliatory strike. And if they ordered that strike before anyone had time to question the data, before anyone could verify what Petrov was already questioning, hundreds of Soviet missiles would leave their silos. And then the Americans, seeing those launches on their own screens, would fire back. A war that no one chose. A war that began not with a decision, but with a malfunction. A war that killed hundreds of millions because one man at one console reported what his system told him to report. Petrov thought about 5 missiles. 5. Not 50. Not 500. 5. Later, he would describe the feeling as similar to sitting inside a burning house and being completely unsure whether you are dreaming. Every signal said, fire. Every instinct said, something is wrong. He chose instinct. Petrov reported the alarm as a system malfunction. He picked up the telephone, not the one that would have sent the alert upward through the nuclear chain. but another. He reported to his duty log that the early warning system had produced what he believed to be a false alarm. He was not certain. He could not be certain. If he was wrong, if the missiles were real, his hesitation would mean the Soviet Union had no time to respond. Millions of his countrymen could die because he had doubted a machine. He sat with that possibility. He held it. And he waited. The minutes passed with a weight that cannot be measured in ordinary terms. If the missiles were real, they were traveling at roughly 6 kilometers per second. Every minute of silence from the ground radar was a minute closer to the moment of impact, or a minute of confirmation that nothing was coming. Nothing came. No impact. No secondary confirmation. No frantic reports from monitoring stations across the Soviet Union. The screens that should have lit up with approaching warheads remained quiet. The investigation that followed determined the cause with a clarity that, in retrospect, was almost absurd. A rare alignment of sunlight, cloud formations, and the angle of the Soviet satellites had caused the sensors to register reflected sunlight as missile launches. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do: detect a heat signature. And it had detected the wrong one. 5 missiles that never existed. The men who investigated the incident were not grateful. They were uncomfortable. Petrov had deviated from protocol. He had not escalated. He had made a judgment call in a system that was not designed for judgment calls. The entire structure of Soviet nuclear doctrine rested on the assumption that people in Petrov's position would follow the chain. Quickly, completely, without hesitation. His deviation, even though it had been correct, was an implicit criticism of the system itself. He was not punished, exactly. He was not celebrated either. He was quietly transferred to a less sensitive post. He received a reprimand, not for the decision, but for the paperwork around it, for failing to fill out his duty log correctly in the chaos of that night. And then, the world moved on, without knowing. The incident was classified, filed away, hidden inside the machinery of a state that did not celebrate doubt, even when doubt had saved it. The world did not learn what had happened that night for more than a decade. When the Soviet Union collapsed and some of its secrets began to surface, the story of Petrov slowly emerged. Not through official acknowledgement, not through a ceremony or a commendation. Through the recollections of men who had been there, filtered through the careful work of historians piecing together a night that had almost become the last night of the modern world. Petrov himself was modest about what had happened. He deflected credit. He pointed out correctly that he was not the only safeguard in the system, that even if he had reported the launches confirmed, there were other steps, other officers, other levels of verification before any missile would have left its silo. He may have been right about that. We cannot know. What we do know is this. In a system built for speed, Petrov chose slowness. In a doctrine that demanded escalation, he chose restraint. In a room full of alarms and shouting and flashing screens, he chose to sit with uncertainty and wait for the world to prove him right or wrong. The world proved him right. But there is something else worth sitting with. The fact that Petrov's hesitation saved the world, if it did, was not the result of a policy. It was not the result of a safeguard that anyone had deliberately built into the system. It was the result of one man's intuition, operating in a gap that should not have existed. The system was not designed to be questioned. It was designed to be obeyed. That is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Because the next time a false alarm sounds, in any system, operated by any nation, the man or woman sitting at that console may not be Petrov. They may be someone who follows protocol exactly, someone who escalates immediately, someone who trusts the machine completely. And they would not be wrong to do so. They would be doing exactly what they were trained to do. That is what makes this story so difficult to hold. It is not a story about heroism exactly. Petrov himself resisted that framing. It is a story about the gap between the systems human beings build and the judgment those systems can never fully contain. About the moments when the manual runs out and something else, experience, intuition, doubt, has to fill the space. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017 at the age of 77. He spent the last years of his life in a modest apartment in a Russian town called Fryazevo. He received some international recognition in the final decades of his life: awards, documentaries, acknowledgments from organizations that had finally begun to understand what that night had meant. But for most of his life, he lived in a silence that matched the silence of the world around him. Nobody knew. People went to work that morning. Children went to school. Cities moved through their ordinary rhythms of traffic and commerce and small human concerns. None of them knew that the night before, in a sealed bunker outside Moscow, a man they had never heard of had looked at an alarm that said the world was ending and decided to wait, decided to think, decided, against everything he had been trained to do, to doubt the machine. And so the morning came, and the world, unknowing, continued. There is something both comforting and deeply unsettling about that. Comforting because it happened. Unsettling because of how it happened. Not through design, not through diplomacy, not through any agreement or policy or carefully constructed safeguard. Through one man, in a room, alone, thinking. The 1983 false alarm incident would remain one of the most significant and most obscure near disasters of the nuclear age. Other close calls existed, moments when communication failures, misread data, or military exercises had briefly suggested an attack was underway. The world navigated all of them, narrowly, and mostly without knowing. That is the nature of the line Petrov stood on that September night. It was not a dramatic line. It did not announce itself. It did not give him time to prepare or reflect or weigh his choices carefully from a position of safety. It was a line that appeared suddenly, in the middle of an ordinary shift, in a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and electronics, under fluorescent light, with 50 people watching and a telephone waiting. History often works this way. Not through grand declarations or inevitable forces or the slow turning of great gears. Sometimes history turns on a single person, in a single moment choosing, for reasons that no protocol anticipated, to wait. Petrov, when asked in his later years what he felt in that moment, said something quiet. He said he was not a hero. He said he was simply a man who had been in the right place at the right time, with perhaps the right amount of doubt. Perhaps that is the most honest summary of what saved the world that night. The right amount of doubt. If you value stories about the moments that shaped history, like this video and subscribe to Echoes of Greatness.